Hey everyone, in this episode we're going to be talking about customer journey mapping. What is it, how does it work, and how can it help you? Stay tuned for the next few minutes and learn more. Let's start off with the obvious question. What is customer journey mapping? Customer journey mapping is really about the experience that your customers or users have while they're interacting with your brand. It's a tool that helps lay out the steps and tasks that a user is trying to complete as they have these interactions. Let me give you a very simple example. Let's say you're trying to book a ticket online or maybe from your mobile device. What is that experience like? Is it similar from the website to the handheld device or tablet, or is there a disconnect? What if they're going into your retail store or trying to order something from your website? These differences in the pain points that users have are mapped out in a journey map. You look at things like action, time, the types of devices that users are using. So you take all of these things into consideration, and it really paints a picture of the journey that a user is actually going through. What you're really trying to do is understand the emotional state of the user. Are they having a bad experience? Are they having a good experience? So if you can identify those bad experiences, those pain points, if you will, then you are more informed on what you need to do to actually fix them. Another question we get a lot is how and when you should create journey maps. In most instances, it's used to really identify the breakdowns in the journey themselves. So you'll hear me refer a lot to pain points or friction points. So if you can identify these types of pain points, especially in the revenue generating actions, then you're more informed and better equipped to deal with them and take the appropriate actions to optimize those experiences. A great example of this is if you've ever used your mobile device to, say, search for a product and then decided you wanted to go into the retail store to see the product. How is the experience different? Did you have a very positive experience on the mobile device and then a bad experience in the store, or did they complement one another? So the answers to those questions are vital when you're looking at a customer journey map. One best practice to take into consideration is you do not want to develop journey maps in a silo. And going back to the example a moment ago, when you're looking at different devices or maybe they're going into your retail store, those are typically different groups within an organization with different managers and different staff and different budgets. So if you develop in a silo and you know for a fact that the users may cross over into other areas, it's critical that you're communicating with these other departments. So what are the main benefits of all of this? Well, what is the value to your organization if you understand the friction points that your users are having? So I hope you enjoy this webinar. It's about 30 minutes long, and we're going to be getting into a lot more topics in detail around some of what I mentioned already. So thanks again for joining. All right, well, go ahead and dive in. I want to thank everyone for joining this call. It's a 30-minute webinar on customer journey mapping. I have with me Robert Gracious, who is going to be taking us through kind of the inner workings of journey mapping, how they work, how do you create them, how can you use them within your organization. I'm going to kick this off and take you through some basics. My name's Jason Moshe, and we're just going to talk a little bit at a high level, and then we'll dive in deeper, and we're actually going to show you an example of how this actually works. So hopefully you get a lot out of this session. So again, what is it? How can it benefit you? And how do you go about creating one? So we're going to cover all these topics in a very short period of time. So journey mapping is really the process by which you tell a story of a consumer and their interactions and journey as they interact with a brand or maybe a government agency. So when we talk about customers or users, it could be a citizen. Anybody that's interacting with an agency or company is what we're talking about. And really, it's the process of how you identify the specific action points that a user takes as they're interacting with the brand or that agency. So it could be within an application. It could be when they're calling in to a call center. What does that interaction look like? And the main thing you're trying to figure out are the friction points or pain points that exist in that journey. And this will all make sense at the end, why you identify these pain points and how that actually translates into action being taken internally. Let me keep moving. So journey mapping is really about getting a better understanding of your customers, their needs, their pain points, how they're interacting. It's also looking at the context as well. And you'll see this when we get into an example. Are they coming in through a mobile device? What does that interaction look like? What happens when they then call in or they want to go to the website? What does that interaction look like? So typically consumers and users don't take a linear path. They may look on the phone and then call in. So a journey map kind of outlines all of that in one view. So you can kind of see from beginning to end, what's the journey look like? What are the different devices they may be using? What are the pain points that exist in that journey to complete some task? We're also looking at things like data. So what does the voice of the customer look like? Are they experiencing pain as they interact with the brand or with an application? You may be looking at things like time to complete tasks or time on a web page, things like that. So the data kind of plays into that. And usually user experience experts or customer experience experts are looking at these things to try to figure out how do you improve the process overall. What you're trying to do internally within your organizations is to build credibility into the how you prioritize tasks and how you prioritize projects. So for example, if you're figuring out trying to determine a particular journey, say for an action that a user takes, maybe going to the website and registering, for example, then are there pain points? And if there are pain points, how do you prioritize that into a roadmap where you may take action later and try to get budget on those items as well? So it's a way to build credibility internally because you're basing it on research and you're mapping it out in an easy to view a document where you can actually walk through it with stakeholders and identify what actions need to be taken down the road, maybe in a roadmap. So one thing about journey maps is they're useful across industries. We've worked in a lot of different industries and we've seen them all over the place. So if it's aeronautical or if it's financial or if it's government, journey maps is something that could be used universally across industry. So it doesn't really matter if a user's interacting with you, you can build a journey map for that. I'm pointing to CX for all of you who are familiar with CX and kind of what that is. I'm gonna have a little poll here. I'm gonna go ahead and start just to get a feel of how many of you are familiar with the CX index. This is a report that's put out by Forrester each year. This is a 2019 view, and customer experience is an important factor here because you're trying to improve the customer experience. So in your positions, you may be talking about how do we improve the CX or the customer experience overall. And I wanted to show this slide just to give you an example of what exists out there and some of the data you can go get. Journey mapping is used within the CX context. So if we're looking at improving the customer experience, what are some tools and techniques that we could use to figure that out? How do we improve it? Well, again, I pointed to those pain points. We can improve them by getting rid of those friction areas, right? So if you look at this list here, you can see pretty interesting who falls at the top of the rankings in this report. And there's actually one for the federal government as well that you can go download and look at what agencies rank the highest basically in government. So this is an interesting report. There's a lot of other data points in this. So I definitely encourage you to go take a look at it. But when you think of CX and you think of how do we improve the customer experience, journey mapping is a very good area to start to really understand how is a user or citizen interacting with our organization and how can we make that smoother? How can we optimize that experience for them? And that's one of the benefits of doing a journey map. So what we're going to do now is Robert is going to be getting in under the hood a little bit on a journey map. We have an example we're going to show from beginning to end. We'll talk a little bit about prototyping as well and how do you take action on a journey map. So that's one of the things we want to get across is How do you go from a strategic roadmap and what you're doing? How do you create a journey map? And then ultimately, how do you take action on that journey map? So if there is a pain point that a user's having, how can you go about actually fixing that pain point? So Robert's going to walk through all of that in the next 20 minutes or so. The chat line is open, so I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, just type them in there. And if we have time at the end, I will read off the questions and we'll try to answer those, okay? So Robert, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. I really appreciate it. So now what I want to do is, as I'm walking you through the steps for creating this journey map, please note I'm going to use a real world example that I've modified just a bit for use in this webinar. But ultimately what I wanted to do is be able to use this example so that I could really show you in context how I break down the steps that's used when creating the journey map. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So this example that I'm showing you, this was a journey map that was part of an HR digital transformation project that we did a few years ago. And this is really ultimately the overarching goal was to redesign key HR experiences in order to really better serve the needs of the employee. And when I say employee, this really included both the HR staff as well as the employees that they serve. Ultimately, our challenge was really to redesign a holistic experience that covered the complete employee lifecycle from hire to retire. So you'll see in this journey map that we're focused on the onboarding process for a new employee, Susan Weber. In this example, Susan had recently completed her onboarding with the company. So what was nice is that when we talked with a number of the employees to gather the data to conduct the research that informed this persona in this journey map, we had a wealth of information that was still very relevant that helped us in creating this map. So this really brings me to the first point that I want to make in our webinar is that the first part of creating a journey map is making sure that you pick a particular persona or create a persona and then look at the specific journey from start to finish. In this case, we're really mapping that new employee onboarding experience. So once you know who you're creating this journey for and that's the scenario that you're mapping, there's a number of key elements that are really recommended that you include in a journey map. Keep in mind that there is no one single, like one size fits all or a template that you use for every type of journey map. I'm sure if you guys were to go Google it, you'll see just a variety of different formats and approaches. Again, what you need to do is make sure that you're using or creating a journey map that is really tailored to meet the need of your organization and the project that you have at hand. Again, with that being said, these are the ones that we recommend, and you'll find that some of these are also going to have different level of significance depending upon the different user experience that you're mapping. So like as an example, let's say you're modernizing for mobile. Well, then really understanding the devices that are being used, understanding that technology and then the context of usage with that technology is going to be something that's crucial that you'll want to make sure that you include in your journey map. Another item that I want to highlight is the touch points. Touch points are really defined as moments within the experience or that journey. And it's really important to point out that on a journey map, you really need to make sure that you're looking at it holistically, that you're not just looking at digital, right? So in terms of, say, for example, receiving a text message, you want to look at the physical environment as well. So in this journey map, for example, where Susan met with her HR manager in her office, you'll also notice that these different elements can overlap and be combined. So again, showing the environment, having those touch points, really talking about the different actions that were being taken and so forth. Another thing that's important that I want to point out is the emotions and thoughts. And this is something that is truly unique to a journey map, but it's also really crucial to be able to articulate this in the map because what this does is this provides a very powerful communication vehicle for being able to relate the behaviors, the attitudes, and some of the feelings that happen for that user throughout the experience. And why this is important is because oftentimes when you run into challenges on a particular project, you have difficulty in really sort of unearthing the why that things happen. So why was this a pain point? What were their feelings around that? What were the actions that they took? All of these things provide insights and clues into different opportunities on how you may be able to alleviate that pain point. So again, being able to map those emotions and thoughts throughout the journey is something that should not be missed. So I think another thing that's important to point out is that, a journey map ultimately is not a work of fiction, right? In order for this to really be useful, a journey map has to be informed by data. And in order to do that, you really should be looking at both sides of the same coin in terms of the data that you collect by looking at both a qualitative as well as the quantitative research. So I wanted to show this as a simple example of some of the different things that you can do up front. So for example, before going into journey mapping, there was time spent, talking to the users, whether that be through field research or even through other means such as like voice of the customer analytics. Ultimately, what that's going to do is help shape and define your users and those personas that ultimately are going to then be used to create the journey maps. So while I've talked about research and there's a number of different techniques that can be implemented, I just want to highlight a couple that really can touch upon both that qualitative and quantitative data points. And I think it's important to note that oftentimes folks will say, okay, when you talk about qualitative, what do you mean by that? And the qualitative is really where you start to provide the information around behaviors and attitudes in your experience. And as I mentioned before, this is really crucial in understanding the why your users take certain actions, or what are some of their motivations that they may have throughout the journey. And this can really be accomplished through both interviews as well as observation. Sometimes that can be done whether that's field research, job shadowing, for example, or even things like contextual inquiry, which is really sort of a combination of interviews and observation. We're really going to you're actually meeting with a person in their environment, but you have very directed questions that help probe to again really start to uncover more of the why behind what they're doing. The voice of the customer in the analytics is also important and sometimes overlooked because in addition to understanding sort of the why, it's good to be able to get data that really starts to inform, some of the trends and things that are happening, so that you're not just focusing on outliers, but you're starting to then better prioritize and understand, okay, where are these things happening, when is it happening, and so forth. And this is where the quantitative can really help. And so there are different tools that are out there, such as Qualtrics or Adobe Experience Cloud, that really allow you to gather that information, whether it be through a survey, chatbot, or other means. And what that does is allows you to really aggregate that data so that you can then start to map and look at it from both a quantitative aspect. Now, another item that I wanted to highlight that I don't have here is also usability testing. Usability testing can give you both the qualitative as well as the quantitative in terms of really seeing what works and doesn't work and how often that happens. So the key is that once you've collected your data from your research, what you want to do is put that data to use. And a fantastic tool for this is the persona. And a persona is actually an archetype of your user. Typically, this in this example with Susan Weber, this was done by bringing together a lot of different data points from a number of folks that we spoke to. And we were able to use this to really to shape that persona. And think about it as a persona being a design tool that really allows your team to better understand and communicate the needs of that particular persona. And most personas, and again, whether it's an employee or a customer, if you're working in the federal government, it could be a citizen. Um, this persona typically will include a name, a picture, demographics, and again, you're articulating the data that you've gathered from your research. What's really also important about a persona is if you've ever been in a situation where you're at a crossroads in your project and you're trying to make a decision on going one direction or the other, oftentimes you don't want to rely on people's opinions. The persona provides that valuable tool to be able to be the tiebreaker, if you will. Rather than going by people's opinions, you can go back to the persona, you can go back to the journey maps and use that data as leverage to be able to make those important business decisions. All right, so let's go ahead and start to build out the map. So now that we've got the persona and we understand what our journey is, the first part is actually mapping out the different stages. So you'll see here in the legend that I have at the bottom that in addition to all the other key elements that I'm going to be adding to this map as we're creating it, you'll see that I'm looking at what are the stages. So in this case, starting with enrollment for onboarding, doing the setup, the training, the goal setting, and the review. So again, remember, this was not arbitrary. All of these stages we learned from doing our research at the company and really finding out about what are the different steps in the process. This is just being able to actually map it out and articulate it. Again, if you look at the legend at the bottom, what we're going to be doing is actually starting to create the touch points, identifying those key moments, again, looking at the feelings, starting to then call out what are the different pain points and opportunities. And then finally, this is something that's unique to our customer journey maps at OneSpring. We have a link. As you can imagine, I'm showing all this to you in a PowerPoint, but the actual journey maps that we create go beyond paper. We actually create interactive customer journey maps. So that allows us to be able to link, say, prototypes or other deliverables or anything that's a sort of a vehicle, if you will, to help communicate that experience within the journey map. So that's just food for thought if that's something that you and your organization would like to do as well with your journey maps. So the next step is once we've mapped out the stages, we go in and look at what are the different touch points. So in this example, you'll see that we have a call with a hiring manager and enrollment. We have where Susan's completing her HR forms. Then during the setup, we have the initial login, configuring work applications, and so forth. Now, what's also important is that when we had different aspects or highlights within that scenario, as we're creating this journey, we also wanted to be able to bring this into the journey map. So you can see we have a scenario that's really talking about the enrollment stage, having the call with the manager to really understand, the steps for enrollment, reviewing the forms and asking questions. So what this does is this really starts to tell the story. And that's also a really crucial element of any customer journey map, is this needs to be understandable. Anyone should be able to pick this journey map up, walk it end to end, and really have much better, thorough understanding that they can share with others to really help everyone get on the same sheet of music, so to speak. So in this example, you also see we started to actually highlight some areas where we've already started to identify needs. So once you actually have the touch points mapped out across the stages, the next step is now starting to inform each of those to really identify, okay, what are those key moments? And then how was that informed by the different emotions or attitudes that happen throughout the journey? So to do that, what we're able to do is then start to bring in the actual next dimension, which is the feeling. So as you can see here, we started to shift those different touch points to really show about, what was Susan's reaction? How was she in terms of she was having her call with the hiring manager? It was a good touch point. It was a key moment that really we found some key highlights. And again, you'll see that where we have need below and then the complete HR forms, this was something that helped then in the future inform us of an area of opportunity that we wanted to address, which I'll talk about in just a moment. As we continue through the journey, you can start to see that when we have those dips in the feelings, that starts to really reflect those pain points or where there was frustrations or different sort of negative attitude in that journey for various reasons. So we really want to be able to unpack that from the research and be able to again make sure that we include that in our story. So as you can see, this really goes throughout the journey where we're talking about different technologies, where she's talking on whether it be on the phone, where she's completing HR forms online, or even offline in the paper environment, going to the initial login, configuring her different work applications. So you can see the different devices and technology. You can see the different, again, dimensions in terms of environment and places, as well as some of the actions that she's looking to do. So an event where she's meeting with her manager and setting goals, and then ultimately taking us all the way out to the 30-day review, and then ultimately establishing that future plan. Next, what we want to do is actually call out what are those moments that matter. So in this case, within the call with the hiring manager, as I mentioned a moment ago in our scenario, there was a key pain point that Susan had, and that was that her manager really didn't have the answers, to her questions, which was very frustrating for her. But you also had other areas where it's showing that, she was excited to start using these new tools and getting onboarded and getting up to speed. She's also talking about here where there's an opportunity where she said, hey, this would be really helpful if all this, employee manual was online and she could do this more in a digital environment. And in that, we even were talking about the idea that out of this, there came some ideas around where where could we take this even going into a mobile environment to make it more readily available, both in terms of not just on the company's intranet, but also available outside the company as well. So this brings me back to the next stage in terms of where I showed you the plan earlier, and that is once you've started to create the maps and you've identified these different areas of opportunity based upon pain points and so forth, you want to be able to go back to your plan or your overall roadmap. And this is when you can start to actually group and really create those affinities and begin to prioritize and say, okay, what are the different projects or initiatives that we need to address? And again, this is where the journey map is a very valuable tool in helping your organization to communicate, because now you have a shared understanding of those particular areas, and it can help you to then better prioritize those initiatives that you want to create. In this particular example, as I mentioned earlier, there was the idea of creating this onboarding application. So another pain point that we had mapped was needing help specifically on the areas of their forms when when Susan was completing her HR forms. So she had run into trouble within the W-4 because she wasn't sure about deductions and whom to go to get that additional information. So in this example, you'll notice also on the journey map that down below, I have a link that I've created. So what we did in the project was this gave us the ability to go ahead and say, why don't we create a concept prototype? We'll do this in really low fidelity to just rapidly flesh out a potential solution and see if we can come up with an approach where we are able to actually socialize this and see if we can get by and if we're going on down the right path for being able to solve this problem. So imagine again, you're in the interactive map and you click on that link. What that would do is actually take you into the beginning of our prototype. So in this, we're talking about here was the problem statement, here was our opportunity, and then here was where we wanted to actually start to ideate on a potential solution. So what we did, again, working very quickly in an agile fashion, is we started to work in low fidelity and we mapped out a scenario for an HR mobile app that essentially served as a dashboard for all of Susan's HR needs. One of the things that also came out of this that was important was we had learned in our research that as folks came on board with the company, that they were assigned an HR representative to be their guide throughout their enrollment and the new employee experience. Most employees that we talked to didn't even know that they had a representative or how to contact them. So this was something that was key, and we actually included this in our concept prototype that you can see here, so that in this example, we were able to rapidly build this out, take it around to management for initial validation and testing, and then ultimately this ended up being, if you will, the springboard for a later application that ended up on the official roadmap. So in this example, you can see how, again, going back to the full map with all of the different pain points and opportunities, you can see how a customer journey map is an incredibly valuable tool to be able to better understand not only the needs of your users, but ultimately to use as an organization to better communicate and help align stakeholders on priorities. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Jason and field any questions that we may
Good.
have.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate it. So I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions. I actually have one that popped up, but if you do have questions, please put them in the chat really quick and we'll try to address those for you. If not, you can reach out to me at any time. There's my email address. Please feel free to reach out. There's one question that somebody asked that says, does journey mapping work within an Agile Scrum framework? So I wanted to see, Robert, if you can answer that.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it does. So what's nice, and you probably picked up on this as we were going through the journey map, is that when you think about Agile Scrum and the construct of a user story, so as a user, I want to accomplish X in order to derive this benefit, there's absolutely great alignment with that and the personas and use of journey map. And so oftentimes as folks are creating user stories, they have difficulty in really articulating that story as well as the acceptance criteria. So again, using the journey map really helps you to inform and create better user stories. And it also helps you better understand what could potentially be the different stories connected to that overall epic or that larger story or scenario, if you will, that is often tied right to a journey map.
Okay, great. And another question, time frame of project. I guess the project you just showed, what was the time frame for that?
So this was actually a 60-day time frame. So that's the other thing about journey mapping is that this can be scaled. You don't have to create a lot of journey maps in order to get value. So when I say 60 days, that's from start to completion, really being able to go out, do the planning, identify the different folks that we needed to talk to in the field to conduct the research, gather that data, organize it, and then really start creating those maps. And that even includes the low fidelity prototype that I just showed you, where we were able to build that out on an iPad app to articulate the potential solution.
So just a couple more questions. What are the typical skill sets that you would bring on board to help create journey maps?
So ideally, anyone can create a journey map that is able to go out and start to gather information. Typically, the skill sets that we employ are user researchers, folks that have background, sociology, psychology, human factors, given that's our specialty. But business analysts in a large organization that may not have user research or user experience professionals can also go out and do the analysis, conduct the interviews, and so forth. Um,
Okay.
and then another it would be in terms of having not only a business analyst and a user researcher, but somebody that is a customer experience or CX professional is another role that would that could easily go out and start creating customer journey maps.
Okay, and one more question, and we may not have enough time to get in this one, but it says, can you share how you use KPIs to show the benefits of telling the customer experience story and give examples of that? Do you have any experience with blending in KPIs into that, into journey mapping and customer experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we can do is that, let's say part of your KPI is to improve your NPS score. So using the data that you would collect, say, through, voice of the customer, for example, you can start to use those techniques to establish a baseline for that NPS. You can then use that research to inform and create journey maps that ultimately is going to help guide you to creating new solutions that will address those pain points, and then do continuous improvement or subsequent testing to then look at how did those improvements affect your NPS score in subsequent, voice of the customer studies. All of
Okay,
that can be
great.
tied back to your KPIs.
All right. Thanks, Robert. So we are at the 30-minute mark here. I want to thank everyone for joining. I hope this was very helpful. We are going to be making this, we recorded the whole thing, so we're going to make the video available to everyone. So I'll be sending out an email with that link probably over the next couple of days. Thanks for joining.